taking notes and I am alone. Okay. So we're debating the second motion. Let's have Prime Minister.
Hello, I'm sorry. We're debating the first motion, right? The one about decentralization.
Yes, I'm the for debating.
Okay,
Oh
cool.
yes,
Thank you for that, Larry.
sorry. Okay.
Okay,
Because
my
I
heart
was
dropped there.
asking for Gov veto and then you put in motion one. So I assume that's what you vetoed instead of that's the motion that we're doing. Apologies.
Okay, I'm sorry. Okay, I assume I'm audible. I'll be starting my timer at my first, right? We want to decentralize because the Philippines does not just equate to Metro Manila, Mega Manila, or Greater Manila. Propose. There are three simple issues within this debate. First is on urgency. How do we ensure that we can reduce this bureaucracy in the first place? Second is on contextual government. How can we better manage rural development and development in general, especially for those areas living in the margins? And lastly is on necessity. Is this something that's going to benefit the Philippines? And is this something that the people even want in the first place? First point. Decentralization in the Philippines is something that we wish to support because it's something that can better deliver tailor-fit policies and for the reduction of bureaucracy to better ensure facilitation of policies and help towards local communities. This looks like us creating responsive and effective laws to ensure that this government structure is going to be put in place. Very simply, this is just similar to the local government code of 1991 being like passed for our country to like better facilitate this transfer of powers between the centralized government within Metro Manila towards other local government units and other neighboring provinces throughout the Philippines, right? When we need to understand that that this primarily happens in two ways. First is that local government units receive a share in the national taxes here in the Philippines through an internal revenue allotment, wherein they're going to receive like a portion of the national budget or the portion of the national taxes based off of how much they need it. And this is primarily going to be calculated on the land mass and the population and the number of businesses within these particular areas. But more importantly, in terms of bureaucracy, this is also going to ensure decision making is going to be quick and that the policies are actually going to be effective in the first place. Because we're not just going to be offsetting these agencies towards these other areas, we're also going to be capacitating these local government units to make these decisions on their own. Because we need to understand that these local leaders or that these locals within these other provinces know what the conditions are within these localities. They know the social and material conditions that's going to be best fit for what they want to achieve for this particular area. Which means that if you're an agrarian like province, you're probably not going to shoot for industrial capitalism. You're probably going to shoot for developing your agricultural industry within your particular area because that is what's going to fit your particular happenstance. And second is on the enforcement of policies. We're going to ensure that these executive units, as offloaded within these local government units, actually have the capacity to do so because they're going to receive like the resources to do this as and also the technical assistance that's also going to be delegated upon them by the local government code of 1991 as these officials are going to be offloaded within these local government units. We'll tell you that this is going to be benefiting on two particular fronts. First is on responsive governance. The main reason why centralization is so problematic is that it doesn't necessarily allow people living in the margins or people living far away from these urban centers to actually receive these policies or to receive these decisions very effectively or very quickly. Which means that if you're someone living in Samar and your government is central and the Philippine government is centralized, you're going to have to wait for the decision to be made in Metro Manila before that even gets to you in somewhere because you're experiencing a calamity or something. That's just going to lead to many more people losing their lives or many more people just losing their livelihoods because they weren't able to fully execute all these policies immediately, and they can't make these policies in the first place because the centralized government doesn't really allow them to do so. But on second is on effective governance, and this is where we push the premium of being tailor fit to these local
Point.
realities because we need to understand that these individuals are actually capable of doing these things and they're already being consulted to do these things in the first place. Why not just give them the burden or the responsibility of carrying these policies out so that they can best deliver on these promises for their constituents? Before I continue, I'll take that point.
Firstly, we tell you that every province probably does not have the same amount of resources, meaning that probably province like Bulacan and Ilocos Norte does not have the same resources in and of itself. Now we tell you if that's the case, how is it more effective? Simply because it is most proximate,
Okay, I
that the
got your
output
point.
of
It's
every
already
provincial.
overtime. Okay, very quickly. This is how we preempted this because we told you that under the Local Government Code of 1991, a pre-existing law, these local government units and these local communities, which don't necessarily have the same amount of money as say Makati or Manila, are going to get these like budget allocations for them. So local government units, which means that they don't have to just rely on their own devices, especially when they don't have enough resources to even do so in the first place. Moving on. We tell you, and this is our second point, that the Philippines requires decentralized governance in the first place. Because let's look at the Philippines very pragmatically, right? First, we are a multilingual and we are a multi-ethnic country, which means that representation is something that always has to accrue when we want to ensure that the people within our country are going to identify with the national identity and even follow the laws that we are going to put into place. This is something that's going to be much better when we recognize them and we give them some level of autonomy through that decentralization at the end of the day. But second is on that we are an archipelagic country. We are just separated by like different islands, different bodies of water, and this is just a problem in the question of logistics. Because how can you even reach these far-flung areas when you're coming from decentralized government? This is something that's just going to take a very massive toll when you constantly have to go back and forth within these particular areas. The reason why centralization is something that's just generally going to be incompatible is we can just look back to our colonial past, right? This is something that's just a colonial transplant. And we could see that despite having like three colonial masters to the Americans, the Spaniards, and even the Japanese, the reason why other areas within the Philippines and Visayas and Mindanao are even trying to secede in the first place, or that they don't even identify with the national identity of being a Filipino, is because these centralized forms of governance can't even reach them in the very first place. The power and the government structure is going to be heavily centralized and representative of those lived conditions happening within Metro Manila or happening within Greater Manila, and these are the only peoples that are going to be represented. And this is problematic insofar as those individuals living within the margins or living within those underrepresented communities are just going to be left to their own devices and are just going to have to hope that maybe the centralized government is going to help them out sooner or later. But more than this, we need to understand that this local government units are going to be are now going to be beholden to the national government as well as the local peoples. This decentralization process is going to serve as the bridge to ensure that these national policies or these national directions are going to be effectively implemented within these localities because the people on the ground are actually going to be capacitated to enforce these policies or to even make decisions on their own behalf because they're the ones who are living within these particular areas. Sure. We identified that there are three possible harms within this particular model that corruption is probably going to ensue. We tell you that this is something that's going to be highly symmetric because you can't really like guarantee, regardless of you're a centralized government or a decentralized government, that corruption is suddenly just going to go to air. We tell you, however, that corruption is going to be tempered when we allow people or when we capacitate people to care even more about their localities and to hold their public officials much more accountable because they're much more proximate to them, as opposed to when the public officials that are making the decisions on their behalf are living within Metro Manila. It's much harder to gain accountability because of the distance and the amount of resources that you have to expend to do so. I would tell you that this is something that the Philippines is probably going to want because one, it's constitutional. Second, it's going to ensure and empower participatory governance. It's going to ensure that people on the ground actually care and can actually have a say in what happens in their lives. And lastly, it's going to reduce the bureaucracy, which is going to ensure that policies and promises are actually going to reach the people on the ground. It's not going to be something that's going to be wasted. These reasons proud to propose.
Thank you so much, Prime Minister. To open the case of opposition, let's have Leader of Opposition.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, loud and clear.
Cool. I'm Carlos, BI's true voice. Preferably 5 minute mark. I will be starting my speech in 3, 2, and 1. I think Gov fundamentally misunderstood what this debate is about because they have to fight for the fact that you're going to aggressively shift power and resources from the central government to local government ones. So what necessarily would this decentralized model look like? So we think this would probably look like provinces keeping more of their collected tax, having wide discretion over budgets and policies, and they're going to face minimal national oversight or bureaucratic delays in development. But I think the missing analysis from Gov is that they fail to take into account that those national problems are still going to be held by Manila. Manila will still take care of the international communications of national things that in the end they will have less resources to tackle this with. So necessarily on the flip, what would a centralized government look like? We tell you that a centralized government would probably look like status quo, wherein a national government collects and redistributes taxes, imposes development standards, and coordinates national scale programs like infrastructures, disaster responses, and education. So necessarily, what do we think would the leaders look like in a national and provincial level, right? We tell you that provincial leaders are probably going to be entrenched in dynasties with uneven capacities, varied motives, and weak accountability. While on the flip, national leaders are going to be more subject to institutional checks, technocratic planning, and responsible for balancing national equity and cohesion. So, let's just summarize this entire debate as early as my speech right now. What would happen to places in the Philippines if we go with their decentralized model? Let's look at three places. We're in Manila, rich provinces, and poor provinces. What would Manila look like? Manila on Gov would look like it would be overburdened with national obligations but underfunded due to reduced remittances. Its ability to fund national programs then collapses. There goes Gov's safety net of them being able to give budget to poor provinces, because where would this budget come from on their side? Now, let's look at rich provinces on Gov. These provinces would prosper, but they would turn inward because they're now going to have the incentive to invest in vanity projects, insulating themselves from national crisis and deepening regional inequality. Now, let's go to poor provinces. Now, they're probably going to be starved of funds, left to fend with limited capacity. Without central equalization, they stagnate or regress, worsening poverty and migration. So, let's go to my responses. Uh, their main case is that goods and services are going to be more proximate to the province and its people. Let's destroy this. First response, their mechanisms are run through in three levels. One, physical proximity does not guarantee delivery because most LGUs lack the technical, financial, and logistical capacity to procure, distribute, or maintain essential services. Decentralization doesn't magically create capacity. Secondly,
Point.
funding becomes more volatile because when local governments keep their own taxes, poorer LGUs can't even afford basic healthcare or education. That's not proximity, that's abandonment. But thirdly, oversight is going to weaken on their side because with less national coordination, service delivery becomes fragmented, inconsistent, and prone to corruption. Now, secondly, even if we concede that's true, all right, we tell you that's true, we question the quality because the proximity they trade off will trade off standardization, scale, and professionalism. A barangay health clinic may be closer, but if it has no doctors, no medicine, and no regulation, it's not a service, it's like, I don't know, a band-aid solution. But on the flip, we tell you that a central government ensures training pipelines, procurement standards, and integrated systems that LGUs cannot replicate on their own. So that's their argument destroyed. The rest of my responses will be folded into my arguments. So let's go to my first point, which is
Point.
the national government serves as an equalizer for regions. Necessarily, the premise of this is simple. Some provinces, like Ilocos Norte, simply does not have the same wealth, expertise, or institutional capacities as places like Bulacan or Metro Manila. Without national equalization, these disparities become permanent because in a country with deep structural inequalities, only the national government can lift all regions together at the very same time. This is true in four mechanisms. Firstly, just look at the fiscal pooling and redistribution, wherein the central government collects national taxes and redistributes
Point.
this to the national tax allotment. This is their same mechanism that only works in status quo. Secondly, just look at the technical expertise in status quo, wherein national agencies have broader access to planners, engineers, and experts, which LGs cannot afford or develop on their own. Thirdly, just look at the scale of the economy, wherein the national government can procure, build, and deliver at scale, lowering costs and ensuring consistency across regions. Just look at, but lastly, even if you don't buy all that, just look at the merits, wherein national oversight applies uniform development criteria, so even politically weak provinces can receive support. So necessarily, this is so important and should be weighed in this debate in three ways. Firstly, just look at the scale. Because millions live in underdeveloped provinces, this affects
Point.
healthcare, education, infrastructure, and even access to justice. But secondly, just look at the magnitude. Because when national support is withdrawn, LGUs cannot maintain basic services and not just lower development, but active regression. And lastly, just weigh on irreversibility, wherein once disparities widen with decentralization, it's politically and economically impossible to rebalance, which means that richer provinces resist sharing and poorer ones collapse deeper into dependence. But before I continue, POI.
Local governments or the central government is not infallible. You said it yourself that you're just more so focused on macro level policies. Is this not the reason why we should offset some resources to these local government units so that they can actually make these
That's the
decisions on their
point.
behalf?
What you're fighting for is offsetting some resources. That's not some. You have to fight for a majority of the resources, meaning it's probably going to be 80%. That's the missing middle analysis on your point. Okay, then let's just flip the entire case on corruption and effectivity. Because we tell you that local governments are prone to corruption and elite captures and are harder to keep accountable when compared to the national government. Because we tell you that the smaller and more local a government is, the easier it is for powerful families and local elites to dominate it, shield wrongdoings, and act with impunity. Just look at in the Philippines, where local government is not often people-led, it's dynasty-led at the very end of the day. This is true because one, local media, civil society, and watchdogs are weaker on local levels. Secondly, local officials are often elected not by platforms but by patronage. And thirdly, local COAs, ombudsmans, and auditors lack the independence, manpower, and teeth to pursue local corruption at the end of the day. But then, let's just prove. Why is it easier to hold national leaders accountable, right? It's easier to hold them accountable because they face broader, more centralized scrutiny. Just we have national media, civil society, watchdogs, and opposition parties all focused on them, while on the flip, provincial leaders are insulated by local loyalty, political dynasties, and limited local oversight. Corruption can go unchecked for years due to lack of independent institutions of the local level and the cozy relationship between these local elites and voters, because realize that local voters are more likely to hold those local people they elected out of loyalty. They're probably going to put them on a pedestal. This will probably look like Davao with Duterte or something. The scale of national politics naturally demands more transparency, while provincial governments operates in secrecy and personal networks. And for all those reasons and more, this is a very clear up-win.
Thank you so much, Leader of Opposition. Let's move on to Deputy Prime Minister.
Hi, let me just set up my timer. Okay. Um, Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I'll start with why ops framing is unlikely, right? Because they talk about how, national government will be the equalizing power by, for example, to empower these local regions, because they posit that, the reason why these healthcare systems in the rural areas are poor, because they talk about, like, you can't really empower, or you can't really develop the healthcare infrastructure in those regions, because even if you empower them, there's lack of doctors in those regions, or lack of nurses. But that's the problem, right? The reason why there's lack of nurses in those specific rural regions is because they moved to Manila, or they moved to another or they move to another country. This brain drain happens because of the structure, because of the centralized structure, because they don't really touch, they don't really go towards, they aren't really felt in the local regions, or in far-flung areas, for example in Mindanao. But more so, right, I think I'm also going to destroy their cases in my extension, right? Because in my extension, I'll be talking about three things on the political, economic, and social side. But first line of discussion then is on political. First point, I tell you that there is more effective legislative practice if you decentralize the government. Because in decentralized politics, right, you empower local government, or like local units. Right? How does this happen? Number one is that you reduce the bureaucracy that's going to happen in status quo, because of that, right? There is an urgent pass of policies that is relevant to their needs. For example, in the growing climate change right now, those provinces are one of the vulnerable sectors. For example, in Cagayan Valley, they're one of the most vulnerable sectors in terms of climate change. But because of that, right, there is an urgency with in climate mitigation and adaptation. But the problem is, these things are merely focused in Metro Manila, or Imperial Manila, because those institutions or head of agencies are based in Metro Manila. So when they want to pass a specific law that is really relevant to them, it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of cost, right? So once you reduce the bureaucracy in the centralized system, at least you are more proximate to the people. The laws that you probably pass or the policies that's probably going to pass or that's going to happen is much more proximate to the experiences of the people. But lastly, then you have more felt trickle down on the people, right? But secondly, you also have more cost efficient, and it's also most time efficient and cost efficient. Why? Because when you pass a law, for example, if you want to pass a law, it takes a lot of resources, right? For example, the political landscape right now. For example, if you're a political representative from Mindanao or from Surigao, if you want to pass a specific law, you have to spend a lot. You have to, attend the hearings in Metro Manila. You have to, and it takes a lot of time. The bureaucratic takes a lot of time. So the moment that, for example, you address a problem, it's already not urgent enough or it's already not timely enough. But the third point of discussion then is that there is a rise of dissatisfaction in centralized government from Mindanao. It's also one of the examples why they want to secede, because they don't really feel the impacts or change in the centralized system, right? They're further marginalized in this specific in our current status quo. That's also why it's more likely for them to vote who gives them money, or why there's more incentive for vote buying, because these people, they are more focused onto what's going to be on their table, right? Because number one, they don't have the economic benefit, they don't have the economic advantage. But secondly, right, it takes a lot of time for something to get to them, right? The result is there is a growing clamor because they're not being prioritized, or there's also lack of representation of them in a centralized government, right? See how many people, how many Mindanaoans people are Bisaya people do you see in the Congress? How many Muslim people from Bar region do you see in the Congress? That's also one of the reasons why. Well, that's also one of the reasons why BARM is a separate entity, but also that's one of the reasons why Mindanaoans wants to secede. And there's a lot of support coming from Mindanaoan people because they feel like the secession of Mindanao is better for them, because then again, it's much more proximate. The result is much more proximate, or it's felt in the ground. But secondly, then the moment that you decentralize the system, it's you also lower the political activity in the local government, right? Later in the local government, what happens is that people are more able to understand politics that they have in the local government. But secondly, you also increase the capacity of people to check the politicians that they put in office. So it's very, very likely that the people that
Point.
see later. Um, sure, PY.
Do you think that Mindanao would be better off if they just kept their resources and seceded from the national government, since the national government is taking a lot of the resources, right?
Yeah, I'm actually going to talk about this on on the later part of my speech. So because secondly, then I'm going to talk about the economic side that's going to happen. Because for now, right, there is an existing prolonging underdevelopment because of colonialism. We have to talk about why Kurt is important in this debate, because he talked about the historical analysis why we are right now, right? Because the reason why we because the Spaniards and Americans built institutions like in Manila and built mega cities in Manila. So the critical problem then is why Manila has more economic activity than Mindanao or than the Cagayan Valley, for example. Because the Imperial Manila bridges the problem between the colonial past and the present problem of today. Because Imperial Manila has far more economic activity because everything is centralized in there, right? The academic development and health development in Manila is Manila focused, right? There's lack of academic discourse in far-flung areas, or like quality academic institutions in, for example, Mindanao. That's also one of the reasons why brain drain happens in provinces. Why Chelsea and I from Mindanao wants to study in Manila, because there are far more better infrastructures here, and it's an academic institutions are built here. Here, the Jesuits, for example, or the Americans, for example, built academic institutions started here in Metro Manila, right? The centralized government. Because the centralization is not just government infrastructures, but also how it segregates regions, for example. We have to talk about, the lack of political agency in the LGUs, but also we have to talk about the hegemonic structure domination of power in Imperial Manila, right? But more importantly, on the social aspect, right? We have to talk about, how there is a dissolution of culture in the centralized government. This is so important because this culture is also very very important, because their identity is, and is their livelihood, right? Once you decentralize the structure, right, you are it's far more likely for these rural areas to take their comparative advantage, for example in agriculture, to be able to, advance their own economy, right? Because the reason why, for example, they are the way that they are right now, and the reason why they have this low economic activity, because everything is blueprinted in Imperial Manila. For example, the reason why you have BPOs in Mindanao, instead of recalibrating their agricultural technology, is because the growth is blueprint in Imperial Manila. But instead, the moment that you decentralize this, you're able to focus on the agricultural sector, and focus on what they can do. For example, you recalibrate the farming industry and the fisher industry that is more proximate to the people, right? With all of those reasons, I think that I've talked about a lot of impacts. Very proud to post. Sorry.
All right, thank you so much to Deputy Prime Minister. Let's move on to Deputy Leader of Opposition. PLO. Oh, it got disconnected, so we can just wait for DLO to come back in.
Hello. Sorry. Wala po ako.
Hi,
Internet
sorry,
na.
wait. It's
Maybe
very choppy. Could you try speaking again? It was very choppy earlier.
hello, am I audible?
Yeah, that's much better.
Wait, what?
I said that's much better.
Am I audible na po? Ngayon.
Yes, I said that was much better.
Guys, can someone send chat? Okay. Okay, thank you. Okay, hi. I will turn off my camera. Hi, my name is Marley. Pronoun she, they, her. I'm in church. Is currently so. Okay. Few eyes on voice. Please, I can see chat. So just turn off your mic na lang. Okay. I'll be accepting up until before 5, I think so. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. If Mindanao succeeds just because it has better resources, isn't the model coming from Gulf replacing colonialism, which they want to champion, with regional
Hi, sorry. Did Marvy get cut off for you guys as well, or is it a me
It did
problem?
get cut off on my end.
Okay. I see.
Marvy is still fixing her net. We're really sorry for the delay because she's in church and you know.
Okay, hi. I'm so sorry. I'll just start my speech. Assuming that I'm audible. Am I audible?
Yep, you're
Okay.
audible.
Hello. Okay, nice. I'll just start again in 3, 2, 1. If Mindanao succeeds just because it has better resources, isn't the model coming from Gulf replacing colonialism with regional elitism, which is they want to champion, right? Where the rich walk away and the poor are left to rot. Isn't Gulf's solution to colonialism just letting rich regions abandon the poor and calling that justice? I don't think they can win this debate with that specific logic. Now, onto my questions. How less bureaucracy, less time, less effort ensure the capacity of all provinces and not just the rich ones? Because they already conceded to us, both PM and DPM. Not every province has the same academic structure, has the same agricultural structure and social structure. That means that they fail to explain how that decentralization will fix this. If anything, this will just show people that the national government doesn't care about them. Now, onto my responses. One, go assume we have good politicians who want agrarian reforms or other specific areas to improve, right? We prove that we don't from part of speech. That even if we have, they're not likely to be elected. And even if they do, they're not likely to be, be much more efficient. Don't rely on the fantasy that local governments will act in good faith rather than technocrats. It's dynasties, it's the warlords, it's the corrupt mayors who are unaccountable, especially in remote areas where media and oversight are likely to be weak. That means the Basilan and BIRMM as a whole, Batuan, for example, as a whole, right, that they want to champion, they cannot win it. Why this is dangerous? One, give them more money, give them much more less oversight, give them much more no central check, and they will entrench their power and not to serve the people because they just assume that they will likely to do public service. Second, they say this is urgent, we bite the bullet. But do you think that the urgency without the capacity for them to establish literally not much more cost harm? And provinces that lack engineers, for example, lacks professionals, lacks planners and clean institutions, for instance, right? It doesn't speed up those developments they want to do. It accelerates much more failure. Why so? Because what's urgent is fixing what's urgent right now in status quo is fixing public service, and that's what we're going to do to strengthen it inside opposition. That's not done by just changing who holds the money, who holds the power, for example, but making sure that the system is capable and much more accountable. Explain it later on. They say this benefits rural areas. We say no. We prove from Carter's speech that it's the opposite. Because under decentralization, those regions to appeal now. Those rural provinces, like for example, Samar, Apayao, etc., for all are going to be further behind because it raises enough money and more or tech expertise, or even I might the bullet attract investment even. So in the case that those tax remittances, as what my partner already told you, on that area will likely to fail again to fail, what will happen next? They need to answer this question I am bringing this with. Gulf creates a two-spin Philippines. Listen to me here. Regions will likely to race ahead. That means that the others to be stagnant, right? PPM claims the systems now become much more faster and we have urgency. But at what cost? Two responses under this. One, reality check faster doesn't mean better. Without the checks and balances they never provide the stakeholders in their framing, often mean that unilateral abuse. It means that there are rush planning that are worse even on the Cordilleras. You don't need decentralization to be much more responsive. You need strong public service system that may likely to, be much more upheld in terms of like centralization to have clear mandates because you have now a uniform mandate and equitable national planning. And you only achieve that comparatively if you have centralization. Because under Sabi House, it is done better if you will just improve the process of centralization because it's more practical even in developing countries, for example, the Philippines in this context, and more efficient. They say, why wait for Manila? I'm going to ask you instead. If Summer is left alone, who will build the inter-provincial bridges right now? Who will fund the schools when local budget is too small? The tax remittances are going to likely be the capital. Who will stop the local cut from monopolizing contracts that they didn't even responded or preempted with, and not even respond
Point.
coming from a partner. It's not about waiting for Manila anymore or centralized, etc., etc. It's about working with the state that has capacity to help everyone, especially those most in need. Now on to my extensions. Why the centralization of governance in the Philippines is much worse in terms of scale and in terms of magnitude of impacts. First, in scale, we have 82 provinces in the Philippines, right? And we have a lot of levels of institutional capacity. We have economic development, etc., etc. Why is this likely to happen? Because centralization just assumes that they have uniform, for example, administrative right now, right? And that reality, most of the LGUs, even in the LGUs that we have in the Philippines or whatever you're funding, they have, lack fiscal systems, even judicial systems compared to the national government, right? Let's have quick reality think tanks, for example, or you don't have a QA on your LGU, you have auditing bodies that will likely be robust capacity. You're going to likely repeat policy mistakes. Because under the Sabi House, they want you to push to provide anything else they cannot even do. In terms of magnitude, why you're losing, right? First, we think that decentralization risks fragmenting national development. Why this is so true? One, those provinces with limited economic activity can self-sustain without the national support, which you only get coming from our side in terms of centralization. For instance, those geographically isolated areas like Basilan or Samarbite, whatever it is, right? Remittances will likely be shrinking, as I already told you. Now the LGUs under Sabi House are left to fund their own development, left to go. Where I'm going to get the investment right if they are not even, investigally, appealing, right? Now, at best under Sabi House, we are much more better for 5 reasons. One, because under Sabi House, centralization does what decentralization cannot. It protects those weaker, those incapable, not empower those strong elites part of the warlords. But then secondly, we're able to plan development based on national priorities and not just specific local interests. But then we're able to have uniform maintain equal rights that can be access to the services for all Filipinos, which I think both of us want to champion. But then lastly, even if you don't believe all that thing that I yap all about, to end this, we're able to provide a safety net and a support system which side government never had. For all these reasons and more, we proudly propose women.
Thanks, Deputy Leader of Opposition. Let's move on to Government Whip.
Hi, can I get a confirmation that I'm audible?
Yep, loud and clear.
Okay, thank you for that. Just I'll start my first word. POI, we have maybe 5 minute mark. I'll try to answer one, but I have kind of some things to say. Okay, starting my speech. 3, 2, 1. I'm so sorry. I haven't started my. Okay, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. What once was USSR's 5-year centralization plan became their eventual demise. But the national government is nothing but motivated by greed and overlook the needs of their people on the ground is where they run out of finances in the future. When your agricultural fields won't yield anymore, you are barraged by climate change in different regions of the Philippines. This is where you shift all the burden towards the capital even more. This has led to massive development gaps then because due to the centralization whose focus was centered only around megacities and their interests, The problem within this debate is not on funding shifts, but the Philippines lack of self-determination to other models of development that fits its specific context. Responses first. Firstly, I think that the entire opposition bench misrepresented their cases. The motion does not say that we are going to aggressively shift. I do not understand why they are putting words in our mouth. We have clarification here that this is going to be transitional in the very first place and it does not happen overnight. But secondly, government's mechanisms are literally why other regions of the country cannot keep up with the progress because development plans are patterned from Manila. There is a concentration of funding on the top up and they never really answer the burden. Why is the status quo sufficient anyway? But even if we bite into their bullet that sure it is sufficient, we are still willing to trade off of trying other mechanisms. Thirdly, I don't understand why they push that secessionism will exist on our side. In fact, we mitigate this because there is historical precedent that proves that secessionism will unlikely happen when the national governments listen to a specific region anyway. Look at the Bangsa model. All it took for them is to be respected and have a level of autonomy to make policies, hence the conflict dying down because they know the nuances of their regions anyway. But lastly, they only push that regions don't have the same resources, then how they will develop then? Again, the question, how will you develop these regions in the future if you don't capacitate them from the top up? How do you give them capacity? You keep pushing these burdens and it's unfair because you never really address them in the first issues then. Firstly, on development and secondly, on accountability. The issue with opposition is that they are debating on the short term, but secondly, they argue how development will be disrupted because there will be a shift in funding. The trade-off that government posits here is that if this means allowing other regions to focus on what they can do best for the meantime, then sure, we'll get that. Then why is it true? Firstly, national policies on opposition are harder to reverse in the first place, especially those that target development. Best believe that senators with the roster we have, we don't necessarily take into consideration how economic development policies will impact agricultural regions when they just prioritize, keep creating business and industrial complexes, or even how this policies heightens climate change. Then why is this bad? Firstly, lawmakers have no succinct idea on what is happening in other areas. They just operate under greed. But secondly, when these policies fail, it's inefficient on time and funding. It may work for some regions, it does not work for others. It's much more costly on time and on like fight on funding because it exists on a larger scale. You have to fund this from the top for it to trickle on the ground. For instance, you have to fund it like $100 billion and then 100 billion pesos, and then it fails eventually. But when you do it on the on the more concentrated area, when you enforce a policy and it fails in concentrated areas, it doesn't have to be as bad on a larger scale, and it is on the national level. So you don't create a domino effect towards other regions. Like look at the rice tarification law, right? The farmers are now
Point.
underprivileged. Even if we have access to cheaper rice, then we solve the issue then, and where more funding is actually efficient. But secondly, on accountability, they say that it does not work for us. Sure, but we will provide other mechanisms for that. But they say that on their side of the bench, there is going to be centralized scrutiny because, again, on our side, it can go unchecked for years and etc. etc. But we don't understand how this is so exclusive on our side when corruption is so symmetric anyway. But sure, even if that's the case, we even think that it's worse on their side because look at the people that's running for Senate. It's literally the same breed of people to protect their vice president. The data on our side is much better because people on the ground, who want to go against the system will have more local capacity to do so because they are not up against the biggest politicians with the biggest political maneuvers. Like, how are you a farmer going up against like BBM, right? That's where we need like Arambulo, like running for senator, etc., etc. Like for instance, chances of Lenny Robredo winning the Naga elections is like higher than her winning the national elections in the first place. But again, it's easier to mobilize with smaller political forces up in your face. But note that councilors or board members matter just as much as senators because they have more funding capacity to create immediate change if they want to. Hence, it's not just against like who's the most capacitated, but who's also the most proximate on the ground. But sure, this is more better than because the level of empowerment that people receive are then closer to people who want to govern them. These are the people that they interact with on a day-to-day basis and not someone they just see on the internet when it is elections, right? To be charitable then, of course, corruption will exist on our side. But they say we don't have enough policing methods. But again, I don't understand why is their push when they never really address the efficiency of national bodies anyway. So, panel, I think this is something that's going to be scratching this debate at this point, right? So, how do we solve their problems on opposition then? Firstly, they say that there's going to be an underfunding of Manila City. I think
Point.
it's not going that Manila is not going to be severely underfunded because they never really prove if the problem is funding or is the problem necessarily corruption. Manila is so developed, like foreign direct investment is robust. This is where like the biggest business complexes are located, like like international partners, etc. Even if regions don't funnel taxes to national government, we don't think it's going to hurt as bad anyway. And politicians will be more incentivized to do better because they know that they cannot corrupt as much money coming from regions as they used to in the past. But secondly, on the quality of infrastructure, sure, we take the trade-off that it might be bad for the short
Point.
term because the cities don't have the capacity in the first place. But when we shift the funding, then there is a long-term perspective on progress, i.e., development, education, and healthcare. The data on our side is we reduce the likelihood of people having to migrate in the future because there are current plans on developing what is in the front of them because the
PRR.
region provide livable jobs and etc. etc. This is where you establish quality infrastructure because people are then incentivized to go to other places anymore because it is a livable job for them anyway. This is where we answer like the problem on like having like we need more doctors or like we need more teachers that are capacitated, capacitated to like work in this underdeveloped areas. It's like literally what's happening in South Korea, like even in like regions, etc. etc. There are like more or like really competent like professionals, right? But thirdly, note that Op never really explained how these benefits will exist on their side because they're operating in the status quo and we are living in the status quo. And this is very symmetricized development further because once these regions become more capacitated, this is where they enter the benefit of equalization. It is unclear how equalization will exist on their side and pushes that there will be more regional divide because regions are not immune of national policies anyway. There will still be a level of interaction. And secondly, it's unclear that this equalization, it's unclear where these inequalizations will come from because we think that even if Manila remains to be the center, the provincial rate will not, even rise and the minimum wage in like provinces will be just like 300 pesos, etc. Exclusive impacts then, tailored fit and proximate responses towards local issues, proximate participation and lower bureaucracy. Again, this is a development debate and you have to look at it in the long term. For all those reasons, go.
Thank you, Government Whip. Let's move on to Opposition Whip.
Hello, my name is Vince, pronouncing in him. May I get verbal confirmation that I am audible?
Yes, loud and clear.
Right, if I lag, kindly interrupt me. So, let me start my speech in three, two, and one. If you want a world in which warlords and dynasties like the Pinedas, Villafuertes, and Dutertes gain more resources and more options to further retain their regional power, then side with side government. If you want a world, and at the very least, we mitigate that. At the very least, there are some safety net mechanisms, and at the very least, we at least like do not let them go overboard. Side with side opposition. Now, panel. Let me go with my speech structure going like this. With first it comes responses. Secondly, with the issue weighing. So first, when it comes to responses, PM came with this debate, equalizing and telling us that proximity will inevitably result in effectivity, simply because it is more effective simply because they prove it by simply telling us that like more the national government is going to that the local government is going to be more effective at delivering resources since they are the most proximate actors to the stakeholders in and of itself. They also tell us that since we are diverse, it is in the best and most proximate interest of the provincial governments, and they are the best actors to actually deal with these cultural differences in the very first place. However, LO makes to you clear that what's truly at stake in this debate are three things. One, whether or not proximity results in effectivity. Two, whether in which world will we actually have a better capacity to deliver services. And three, would it empower bad actors to actually be more corrupt? My LO tells you then, in response to this, by saying that central governments act as an equalizer in these regions in the very first place, that since these regions have varying different economic outputs in the very first place, they tell you this means that the national government is the only actor in this debate that could actually act as a reallocator in order so that the resources for these services can actually be equal in the very first place, right? They actually prove this by three metrics. One, that the national government has the most resources in status quo, meaning that they actually act as a safety net for these local governments in and of itself already in status quo, and these already have they already have like extensive reach in regional offices that allows them to actually reach these provincial like far-flung provinces in and of itself within the status quo, right? So they have the capacity to actually reach these far-flung provinces. Secondly, that they actually like align themselves with the
Point.
that they actually align their national agenda with their national priority. That the policies that are actually at stake in the status quo actually aligns with the national priorities in and of itself. And why we agree that in current status quo there is a current imbalance in status quo is going to be much worse on their side, since they actually like make it permanent and actually make it so that the imbalance in of itself will be innate and will actually start off from the very beginning of the implementation of the policy in of itself. Again, Ilocos Norte or like some far-flung province in Mindanao is not as rich as Pampanga or Bulacan, for example. And secondly, they tell you that ranging actually happens as status quo and that reducing the bureaucracy will result in proximity of opportunity. Therefore, this then will result in proximity of resources, therefore proximity of services. And secondly, the DPM does tells you that that the bureaucracy just takes a lot of time, and if they separate with these countries, or at least the local government or the delivery of services is actually going to be more decentralized, this will result in more efficiency and it's going to be better off for these provinces in of itself, right? But then DPM comes to this debate and tells you that first we assume that local politicians will actually have incentive to actually like create better policies for these people in of itself, when in current status quo they're not able to actually do so, and simply because in status quo that they do not have enough resources. In status quo, yes, they do not have enough resources, but the fact of the matter is, in status quo, even with the minute amount of resources that they actually have, even if it's like it's like I don't know, probably like quite a fewer than what they're actually trying to propose. In status quo, they're not unable to do so, but they're unwilling to actually deliver these social services in and of itself, simply because it is not in their best interest to actually do so. Simply because it's not in their best interest to actually do so, and we actually prove to you why the national government will actually be much better as an actor to actually deliver these resources in and of itself, and much more capable and much more effective. And secondly, they tell you that bureaucracy this takes a lot of time. However, we tell you that economic investment acts as a prerequisite in order for you to be able to deliver these social services in the very first place. Without the income coming from these economic investment, coming from economic production, you won't be able to actually develop these resources and services in the very first place. And they never actually give you any prerequisite analysis as to why these economic investments would come into these countries or would come into these provinces that are actually going to be far flung
Point.
we're actually going to be far flung simply due to decentralization. But I'll not take but first then I'll go into then my issues. So firstly, what's the first issue in this debate? First issue in this debate is whether or not proximity does equate effectivity, or whether or not it's going to be the more who's going to be the more effective actor in this debate. So firstly, Goff argues that that proximity will inevitably result in effectivity, since they're the most proximate actor they're the most proximate actor to the stakeholders in debate. And secondly, that bureaucratic centralization delays progress in these far-flung provinces, since they have to go to Manila and stuff like that. Bureaucratic red tape is very hard to actually outmaneuver. But on op, we actually gave you three things. One, we argue this is untrue due to the fact that firstly, provincial resources are imbalanced, meaning that the local output of every province may not be sufficient to cater to local social services that could otherwise be provided by the central government. Secondly, they never gave you any prerequisite analysis as to how economic investment would actually be gained there, as which
Point.
is the prerequisite in order for actually to gain social services. And C, we also flip this by saying that the central government acts as an equalizer for this imbalance. Manila could equitably allocate the resources for far-flung provinces, and equality would actually be much more assured on their side. So starting from the very budget allocations in of itself, starting from the very starting from the fact that tax remittances will be will be more focused to the local governments in and of itself and not to the national government. This already starts the inequality in and of
Point.
itself. This all sure I'll take the point.
Yeah, central governments aren't infallible. I don't necessarily understand your framing wherein local leaders are going to be evil in their localities, but suddenly if they go to the national level of the government, they're going to be benevolent with their decision making. Please elaborate.
Firstly, we tell you that these local government leaders have more incentive to actually to not actually develop their provinces in the very first place. Since it's much easier for them to actually retain power when their local constituents are actually reliant on them. So we already proved this in opposition. And secondly, that the national government is going to be held much more accountable towards the fact that there are more eyes that are actually going to be looked upon them. Meaning that meaning that in status quo, for example, if you don't actually if the president does not if something that happens ineffectivity in the government happens, the blame automatically is directed at the president or the national government. Therefore, they're already held accountable in status quo. This is true towards the fact that a lot of accountability mechanisms have already been held by presidents. For example, like EDSA 1 and EDSA 2 happened, impeachment happened, and stuff like that. And secondly, that local leaders are are going to hold their power much more effectively if they actually keep their constituents reliant upon them. If you want a world in which these constituents are relying upon these local leaders side with side government, if you want a world and at least these local leaders do not have that, and at the very least we can hold these national government officials accountable. Say it's a position. Oppose.
All right, thank you so much to Opposition Whip. Let's move on to Op Reply.
Hi, am I audible?
Yep, loud and clear.
Cool. Carlos, yeah. I will be starting my speech in three, wait, two, and one. One of the many reasons why Gov loses is that they're so uncharitable. The entire case is that, oh, national government bad. We disproved this. We gave you countless analysis why they're incentivized to at least be good. And even if they're bad, we have countless mechanisms to hold them accountable. On the flip, on our case, we proved two things that are against them just as early as my speech. One, if local leaders are good, they won't have the same capacity, know-how, nor access to things like the national shot without accountability and get fanaticized over it. They never proved three things from Gov. One, the capacity of all governments to use all their new budget. Two, the benevolence of these local leaders. And three, any accountability mechanism that will save their case. Because I think Gov speakers also failed because their PM, their burden because their PM has the burden of characterizing everything about their decentralization. But that fell to me. I had to do that. And then they tried to save it with their whip, but we say late matter. And deputy was a rehash. Now, let's make three key call-outs. First, they never proved capacity. They told you LGUs would plan better, execute faster, and listen more. But we asked, what if they can't? What if they don't? No response. We proved that most LGUs don't have the same tax base, expertise, nor bureaucracy to govern themselves well. But secondly, they never proved equality. They said decentralization empowers everyone. But we asked, what happens to poor provinces like Eastern Samar or Basilan when you cut off national support? Again, no answer. We showed that rich provinces surge again ahead while poor ones collapse. The result is not empowerment on government, it's a two-speed Philippines where the gap becomes irreversible. Third, they never responded to our principal case that the national government is the only actor with both the incentive and the capacity to equalize. It can pull taxes, redistribute wealth, coordinate large-scale infrastructures, and maintain standards. In short, it makes sure no Filipino gets left behind just because where they were born. That's not just pragmatic, that's just. Now, let's destroy the four Hail Marys from Gov, right? Firstly, they told you proximity is better on our side. But we tell you proximity doesn't mean delivery because services don't reach people when local leaders lack the capacity, budget, or will, especially in poor provinces where corruption and inefficiency ran rampant. But thirdly, they told you, oh, local leaders know the issues better. The same leaders who know their people are often dynasts who ignore them, weaponize patronage, and suppress dissent. Familiarity doesn't equal accountability. But thirdly, they told you, we'll just rely on the national government for help. Then that exposes that their model is incoherent because if you still need to send the center to fix failures, then why decentralize in the first place? You're just fragmenting responsibility while expecting central bailouts. And lastly, let's just quote Gov deputy. They just want Mindanao to secede. I think that's just exposes the problem of their case in and of itself. Now, even on their best case, right? Only rich provinces benefit because poor regions remain underfunded, mismanaged, and abandoned, which would just deepen the very inequality they claim to face. They rely on a fantasy of competent, benevolent local leaders while ignoring the reality of dynasties and corruption. At the very end of the day, at best, they create uneven development. At worst, they tear the country apart, and that's not a model worth defending. Opposition wins this by a clear margin because we offer a model that prioritizes equality, accountability, and national unity. We prove that only a strong central government can redistribute resources fairly, enforce standards, and protect poor and vulnerable regions from local abuse, while government gambles on the capacity that does not exist and leaderships that cannot be trusted. We provide a realistic, time-tested framework that keeps the Philippines whole and every Filipino seen, heard, and served. And for all those reasons and more, this is a very clear up win.
Thanks, Op Reply. Let's move on to Gov Reply.
Hello, am I audible?
Yep, loud and clear.
Okay, I will start my timer at my first word. The only way that the opposition's model works is if the Philippine president is going to be Jesus Christ himself. Let's pick up a book on Philippine politics, public administration, and history and check both of these cases. Coming from opposition, they told you that a strong centralized government is going to be great because of two reasons. First is that it's a great equalizer. We'll tell you that this isn't necessarily going to be true because the main reason why local government units even receive money and are capacitated to use it to their best capacity in the first place is because of decentralization. That is because of the decentralization that already exists within the status quo. We don't necessarily understand why they're trying to posit that if money is going to be offset to these other regions, then suddenly Metro Manila is going to go to shit. We don't necessarily understand why it's going to be the case when a lot of different local businesses are already operating to keep these local economies alive. We don't necessarily understand why this is such a big burden. Second is on institutional checks. They tell us that regional elites and local elites are going to dominate Philippine politics if this is going to be put into place or if decentralization is going to continue. We tell you that this is exactly why centralization is so harmful in the first place. Because let's look at history. The reason why local elites are even legitimized within their positions anyway is because that these centralized governments coming from America and Spanish colonial roots is the reason why they were even put in those positions of power. However, we tell you that because of decentralization within the status quo, these leaders are already going to be put in check, that they can't just simply use the amount of money that they have or that they can't just use their connections to the centralized government to run rampant within these localities. They're now beholden to the national government because they always have to answer to them, but also they're going to be much more beholden to the people on the ground, primarily when these individuals have a much bigger stake to hold these public leaders accountable. We tell you that this institutional check or that this safety mechanism is going to be so much worse when the decision makers are so much farther away from the people that they are primarily serving at the end of the day. This is why this centralization model is never going to occur in the first place. But what did we give you? We tell you primarily that resources and technical assistance is going to be the biggest benefit that you can ever get out of decentralization. That if you're a struggling economy, that if you're, like, say, someone from Samar, then your province or that your local government is probably going to be capacitated through internal revenue allotments or through tax tax allocations so that you can actually build infrastructure, or that you can actually do something with the land that you have. And we tell you that this is going to be so much more, so much better and so much more effective when the people on the ground who are actually doing the work themselves, and that they can actually see the social and material conditions of these environments, are the ones who are making these decisions, instead of having to wait for the centralized government to like do these things on their behalf. And second, local leaders are going to be so much more like local leaders are going to be so much more incentivized to actually just be more like not corrupt, because they always have to just like be wary about the fact that if they just try to like fuck up their constituents, then maybe they're not going to be elected on the succeeding terms. But more than that, national government is already going to be holding them accountable. We need to understand that in the project of effective and responsive governance, this can only be achieved in a Philippine state wherein we are a multi-ethnic country, we're a multi-linguistic country, and we are just archipelagic as a whole, to just ensure that these different like political subdivisions are empowered to make these decisions by themselves and to actually enforce the policies that they want to enforce. But more than this is only ever going to be, better and possible if we're going to ensure that the people on the ground can actually like build upon their localities and to just develop their, rural realities on their own, as opposed to just waiting or just basing off of the industrial capitalist frameworks that is most likely going to emanate coming from Metro Manila. These different realities are the things that we want to avoid, and this is something that can only ever be achieved when we just move away from centralizing our government, from concentrating the power and decision making within these centers, and to actually capacitate the people on the ground and these different local government units to do these things so that they can make better provinces and better realities for themselves. These reasons, propose. Yeah, proud to propose.
All right, thank you so much, debaters. You may now cross the House. Just give me a few moments to send in my ballot and deliberate. Thank you. We're still here and complete. So we can start with the oral adjudication. Hi everyone, my name is Neackle Mempin. I was your judge for this round. Here's how my oral adjudication is going to go. First, we'll be giving a few general comments, and then we'll be going straight to the verdict, and then going through the issues to be able to justify that verdict. All right, so for general comments, I think that there had to be a bit more nuanced discussion with what the degree of decentralization currently looks like at the present, and comparing that to the degree of centralization that the motion essentially pushes for. Because I think that government is running a convenient case of saying that there's a greater degree of decentralization. There are existing decentralized features and mechanisms right now, while opposition also tries to operate on the idea that the decentralization now is very minute, therefore it's the central government that has the most oversight, the most power, and whatever. So I think like these two different contexts and conceptualizations of what status quo looks like makes it very hard for me to bite into some of the impacts, as well as some of the reasoning that you guys give me as to why decentralization is good or is harmful to the Philippines. So I think the second thing is that there had to be a bit more charitability in terms of how these things are likely to be implemented and whether or not these things are going to be successful. Because I think that teams have the tendency to just operate on the extreme worst case on either side, wherein a central government is severely failing in its workings, but assuming that the local government units are completely efficient in being able to carry out their mandate. But also conversely, on opposition, you assume that it's the local government units that are severely or grossly mishandling the things that they're expected to do, but the central government and central offices that is attached to the central government are automatically able to achieve X, Y, and Z things like successfully without a hitch. So regardless of those things, I still think that this was a very close debate with a slight margin. So I think that in the future, you might want to consider being able to explore how exactly these regions interact with each other, are likely going to look like, as opposed to just saying that there's going to be varying levels of capacity, varying levels of development, because I think that these are things that already happen within status quo. Therefore, you have to be able to like extensively flesh out how these things interact with the policy and how these things interact with like the changes in decentralization that you are talking about. So with that, I think the win goes to opposition again on a slight margin. I think it's a quite close debate. So there are two main issues that I think were most important. So the first one is, where is public service better off? Which is just trying to explain to me how centralization or decentralization is able to significantly improve how we are able to provide goods and services, for example, to people on the ground, how we are able to reach them at a more significant level. I think, though, that government is quite effective in being able to explain to me why decentralization and the consequent features of a decentralized Philippines, which probably looks like a local government code to be able to efficiently facilitate transfer of powers, local government units receiving significant shares of their tax, and having less of a need to be able to remit tax to the central government, for example, and decision making that is much more nuanced and much more proximate on a ground level is efficient in being able to ensure that we have good public service. So I think that government does sufficiently prove things like capacity and why the proximity is something that's going to result in nuanced policies that are able to serve individuals quite well. And they are also able to illustrate to me why there is an urgency for some level of decentralization, which is the idea that there are a lot of regions in the Philippines that are severely underserved. Therefore, it's important for us to be able to capacitate them at a ground grassroots level for us to be able to ensure that we are able to reach the max amount of people that we have at the present. So while they are sufficient in being able to prove that these things are effective, I think that the mechanism that they provide to us, which is the idea of proximity and being able to capacitate the lowest level that is most accessible to people, is largely operating in a best case scenario that you are going to have the same quality for all of these different regions. And the way that they try to address that is by saying that it's fine if there are varying levels of development, varying paces of us being able to progress. That's because we are able to set very nuanced goals that are largely reflective of what you need in that region and what you need in that area. So I think that it's compelling to an extent when you say that you are able to set nuanced goals, but you don't sufficiently explain why that is going to translate to larger collective development. And that's something that I think that opposition was very strong about, in terms of explaining to me that even when you do have the best case scenario that you prosper, there are going to be regions that suffer significantly because we have less remittances, because we have less power or capacity on a central level to be able to ensure that we reach those areas as well. But also, it's just unclear to me why these things are significantly going to improve at a point in which we decentralize more, at a point in which it's already underserved and undercapacitated at the present. So I think more of an illustration of what the margin is would have really helped make the government case a lot more compelling, at a point at which it's also dependent on being able to prove the next two issues that I'm going to talk about. So for the benefits to accrue on government bench, even when I buy the idea that you're much better off in public service on just a theoretical level when things are decentralized, you have to be able to prove the following. So the first one is, where are we best able to hold these governments accountable? So the accountability mechanism that government essentially posits is the idea that once things are more proximate, people are more likely to care about it. People are more empowered to care about it because these aren't people that are so far detached and removed from you, but these are people that you voted into power. These are people that you interact with on a regular basis. Therefore, it's much easier for us to be able to hold these things accountable. But I think there's compelling material enough on opposition side to be able to explain to me why things like regional loyalty and fanaticism are likely to be things that escalate at the point in which you are isolated from all other external factors and all other external actors that are able to call these things out and check and balance things. So the reason why we have like super long histories of regional dynasties, for example, is precisely because we are so decentralized at a point in which these aren't things that are exposed to the rest of the majority, for example, or we significantly weaken the power of watchdogs and the media to be able to ensure that these things are going to be transparent. So there's less of an impetus for us to be able to call these things out at a point in which the magnitude of the people who are being affected by their acts of corruption, by their consolidation of power, are very small pools of people that are probably placated by the fast promise of public service, by the immediate delivery of goods and services that government is essentially promising to us. So it kind of bites them in the ass in the future at a point in which we have a harder time to be able to correct a lot of these things, and we institutionalize the ability for them to be able to consolidate power and abuse us further. So while I do agree that that opposition doesn't do a sufficient job of being able to explain to me why they are able to solve these things on status quo once we have a more centralized government, there's still sufficient compelling negative material that is able to prove to me that even marginally on a government side, like the negative case still proves that even marginally, the propensity for abuse is still exacerbated to a degree that it becomes irreversible because the collapse of mechanisms that ensure accountability and the consequent equitable distribution of that public service makes it a lot harder for me to bite into the benefits that government essentially gives us in this debate. So it's indeed sufficient for me to believe that even in the best case that the process of decentralizing works on government, there are still glaring spillovers that make it worse, which leads me to the second point, which is equitable collective development. So while I do agree that the best case scenario on government is indeed the most ideal case for regions in the Philippines, it is highly unresponsive to the idea that is brought up by opposition, which explains to me the varying levels of development and paces of development that these people currently experience. So the point in which that we have nuanced means of development and nuanced goals and policies to be able to address those things on government, these things don't necessarily automatically mean that we are able to equalize them in the near future at a point in which we don't have central planning and oversight to be able to ensure that these things are equitably redistributed. So I don't fully buy into the idea that the central government is 100% effective in being able to do this on opposition side. But opposition side does give us the very compelling material, which is the impact of what happens when we simply allow the regions with existing capacity to prosper, absent the consideration of those poor underserved areas that government also wants to be able to serve at the very end of the day. So it's just much more compelling on opposition when they explain to us that essentially we exacerbate and institutionalize things like regional elitism, and we further exacerbate the sentiment that people get when they want to secede, for example, when they don't feel represented, when they don't feel like they are being considered by the rest of the national government and stuff like that. So the point in which we focus our efforts to be able to progress on the very small scale levels, we essentially miss out on opportunities to be able to redistribute and make and target for more collective development, for example. So it's true to some extent that that's not the burden of these regions, but at a point in which it comes at the expense of other regions that might potentially need the funds more, or it comes at the expense of the central government being able to carry out their needs because they have being able to carry out their mandate because they have less of representation, less impetus, and less capacity in terms of remittances. It's much easier for these local governments to simply like focus on themselves and cave inwards in terms of being able to ensure that those benefits are isolated to themselves. But more than that, opposition does also give me compelling material to explain why over time, even in the very best case, these prosperous regions are going to have good policies in the short term. These things are going to erode over time at a point in which you result to vanity projects, you result into a more careless decision making at a point in which you're no longer beholden to the central government, and you no longer have to worry about like development goals that other regions have to put up with and stuff like that. So with those two things, it's still largely compelling for me to buy into the idea that even when you get the very best case of good public service on government bench, one, it's isolated to those regions that are probably already capable of doing so at the degree of decentralization that we have at the present. Two, there's larger avenue for abuse for all of these other regions. And three, it's something that's largely unsustainable at a point in which you significantly weaken centralized oversight and powers that we currently have in status quo. So yeah, decision stands. It goes to opposition at a very slight margin again. Thanks, everyone.